Now what happens next is a process called the citric acid cycle. During the citric acid cycle, this half of the glucose that's remaining goes inside the mitochondrion, and the citric acid cycle happens in here. So we're going to zoom in real quick, and we're going to look at what happens to this remaining half of glucose in the citric acid cycle. Now this cycle is a little bit complicated, so we're going to simplify it down to the very basics of what happens. But the gist of it is that another molecule of NAD plus, remember the empty carrier, comes in and steals these electrons from the remaining part of glucose. So notice now that all of these energized electrons have been taken away from glucose. So these molecules of NADH now store all the energy. Basically what happens during the citric acid cycle is that this half of glucose is broken apart. And when it does, it becomes carbon dioxide. So these are 3 molecules of CO2. And the CO2 diffuses out of the mitochondria and then eventually out of the cell and gets carried away in the blood. That's what happens during the citric acid cycle. Now the final step is really, really small. So what we're going to have to do is zoom in on a little piece of the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. This is where this final step happens. So we're going to go ahead and zoom in. So here we are now zoomed in on the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, right? So this is the mitochondrial matrix in here, and this is the kind of the space between the 2 membranes. So we're zoomed way, way in. Now you guys should remember what these molecules are. Remember what they are? NADH, because they're carrying those energized electrons. Okay? Now, what's going to happen is that these electrons are going to do some important work that helps make ATP. So first, to point out what's what here, these are NADH. These are the electrons. These are some proteins embedded in the inner membrane of the mitochondrion. These little blue dots are hydrogen ions, H+. These are H+ ions. And this here is an enzyme called ATP synthase. These proteins here are just transport proteins. And together they form an electron transport chain that transfers electrons from protein to protein. All right, let's look into how this all works out now. Now that you guys have seen what's what on this picture. These NADH molecules dump off their electrons that they had stolen from glucose, and they give them to the first protein in the chain. This protein is now energized, and it uses that energy for active transport. And it actively transports these hydrogen ions from inside the cell to outside. Remember, this takes a lot of energy to do, and that energy is coming from these electrons which it stole from glucose. This NAD plus molecule, now that it's empty, can now go back out into the cell and steal more electrons from the next glucose. From here, these electrons get passed to the next protein. And this protein uses its energy to pump electrons, H+ ions, hydrogen ions, out of the mitochondrial matrix. Finally, these electrons get passed on to this protein, and this protein does the same thing, pumping hydrogen ions out of the mitochondrion. So now we have a big, what's called a concentration gradient built up. We have a lot out here and none in here. So you can think of these built up hydrogen ions as like water behind a dam. They're going to want to rush back in, but they can't cross the membrane on their own. They need a doorway, and that doorway is ATP synthase. Now, ATP synthase looks kind of like a windmill, and you can't see it here, but the real protein has a space in the middle. And these hydrogen ions can travel through that space and come out the bottom. So they're going to come rushing back in. But the space is grooved, so as they rush back in, ATP synthase spins like a windmill. And as it spins, these spinning arms use their energy from spinning around to take phosphate groups and force them, like this, onto ADP molecules, thus making ATP. So, to recap again, the hydrogen ions rushing back in cause ATP synthase to spin around. And as ATP synthase spins around, it takes phosphates and forces them onto an ATP molecule, thus creating ATP. Kind of like this. Voila, you're making ATP. And this ATP can now be used for all types of cellular work, from making your muscles contract to building and maintaining parts of the cell, and even, as we learned, making your brain work. These ATP molecules are like the cash that drives all the action of the cell. Ooh, I forgot one last thing. This is an important thing not to forget. These two electrons right here, they need somewhere to go after they have landed here. Otherwise, electrons would just get stuck and they wouldn't be able to keep passing through. So where they go is oxygen. What happens is that oxygen splits apart into two oxygen atoms. These electrons join on, and then they bond on to one of these hydrogen atoms. What you have now are two hydrogens and an oxygen. In other words, H2O, water. So thus, the second major byproduct of respiration, water. And what was the input that needed to take the electrons away? Boom, boom, boom. They end up at oxygen. So oxygen carries away the electrons that used to be part of glucose, and you then breathe them out as water. So just an interesting little point here. What happens if your body doesn't take in enough oxygen? Well, what would happen is that the electrons being carried to this process would go through the electron transport chain, boom, 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 but then they'd get stuck there. Others would come in, boom, boom, and they'd get stuck. Finally, these would get stuck. Now, these electrons can only give energy to these proteins for so long. Eventually, they're going to run out, and they won't be able to pump hydrogen ions out anymore. So these hydrogen ions are still flowing back in through ATP synthase. And they will do so until there is an equal amount on either side of this membrane. And once that happens, there won't be any ability for any more to flow back in. And your cell will stop making ATP. Because ATP synthase can no longer spin now because they're equal amounts and there's no net movement in or out. So at this point, you're basically dead because you're not producing ATP anymore. In your brain, which uses so much ATP to keep working, if you keep oxygen from your brain for just 10 minutes, your brain cells will start to die. So in a couple minutes, you can start to have irreversible brain damage. And after about 10 minutes or so, your brain will shut down entirely and you'll be dead. So that's why it's so important to breathe oxygen, to keep this flow of electrons moving through the transport chain so that you can keep pumping it out so they can flow back in.